Rob Bertholf here. I have an interesting course today called Space Race, and this is one talking about really the question of, did we ever actually even go to the moon, and is it possible to go to the moon? Now, before you think I'm going too far off, I'm going to keep this pretty straightforward and just talk about what we can prove and what we can't. And also, I think what's interesting is I'm going to bring something new to the table in terms of looking through the lens of ultimately, elevation. So we got to add some context to this, and we have to start with the Cold War tensions. Ultimately, we understand that there was a war, albeit between the United States and Russia, and it was one of ultimately political, military, and economic rivalry. And what we find is that it all starts with this idea that they wanted to be able to have the upper hand and be able to fire a missile from Russia over to the United States. And they started to develop this technology called intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. And what was interesting is that while they were testing these ICBMs, the scientists unexpectedly discovered these zones that had a heavy amount of charged particles held around this, our magnetic field. And they were getting some odd readings. And so they said, okay, the sensors were detecting these really high levels of radiation at a specific altitude. And they never encountered this before. And so they led really to a top secret initiative to kind of further investigate these abnormalities, right? These anomalies, right? Fearing that they maybe impact the safety in the future of the unmanned of this manned space missions, right? Or see how this could be weaponized. And so realizing the implications of this high altitude radiation and other phenomena, right? They put together the launch of Sputnik 1. And officially, it was the first artificial satellite into Earth's orbit, symbolizing, Soviet technological advancement. But unofficially, it was actually a reconnaissance mission that was equipped with sensors to measure radiation levels, magnetic fields, cosmic rays, etc. In fact, it was the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile developed by the Soviets. It was just used as the base to be able to launch Sputnik 1, right? This satellite, this probe, really. And it's important to mention who was guiding this, right? And so when we see who was actually guiding this, Sergei Korolev, I'm not going to be able to pronounce any of these Russian names probably, but what's interesting is they adopted the same technology that they had previously built, but what they launched was publicly known to be a radio transmitter that was sent beeping signals back to Earth, which themselves caused a mix of awe and anxiety globally. But when we look into it more, this Sputnik 1, ultimately we can look at what it contained. And the classified instrumentation, that was on board was there to gather data about the upper atmosphere and the outer reaches of Earth's magnetic field. So the mission really aimed at mapping radiation belts and to detect any anomalies that may hint at extraterrestrial interference or some sort of unknown phenomenon. And it's so important to kind of get a sense on the heights that they had, published that they've gone on. Now, this is where Sergei Vernov comes in, right? And he was a leading figure in the Soviets' exploration of cosmic rays, high energy radiation, originating outside the Earth's atmosphere. So this is the scientist that's on this project, and that's really telling about the mission of the project. So, in fact, Sputnik 2 was really the first ICBM developed by the Soviet Union that was used to launch Sputnik 1, but now it has more devices on board, right? It's carrying these two ultraviolet rays, measuring X-rays, right? Ultimately, they were really looking to detect more information. And what's interesting also is they had included a dog on board. And so based on the data they collected, the next mission, they sent a dog, Latka, whose mission was to assess the biological effects of this newly discovered high altitude phenomenon, right? This radiation belt. And, it really kind of stirs in, a myth, really an ethical debate, right? Of this, but ultimately they were just trying to figure out, is the thing going to live if we shoot it up there? Bottom line, and what's the effects of this? And this then brought on Sputnik 3. And this one had an even larger bay for more instrumentation, right? For them to now measure the intensity of the cosmic radiation, essentially. So what they're finding, just to make it simple, is they were collecting as much data as possible in order to see if they could break through this radiation field. Now, this activity did not come without a response from the United States. So in 1957, the U.S. launched, their version by creating the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958. So NASA is created. It was ultimately designed under the direction of Wernher von Braun. Now, when we start looking into this more, we see this is interesting how, this logo is developed with a serpent's tongue. I mean, this thing is, it's just got some interesting symbolism, right? Now, once you see this, by the way, you'll never unsee it, right? Anyway, they later changed the logo, but kept the important part, which was the serpent's tongue. And it's a symbol of deception. And again, once you see it, you're not going to see this ever again. But more than that, more than the shady logo, right? It's the shady people behind it. And actually, NASA was founded by Nazi scientists. That's a historical fact. And we actually learned from Operation Paperclip, where the United States brought in over 1,000 Nazi scientists in order to create, their program. And they were led by an officer of the SS. He was a member of the Nazi Parliament, right? Party, I should say. And he was very instrumental in not only the United States creating NASA, but also seeing that the United States formed a second organization called DARPA. And DARPA, which was the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, was really created to, I don't know, well, let's put it like this. They were doing a lot of additional movement, and it shaped our modern world. Weather satellites, GPS, drones, stealth technology, voice interfaces, even the personal computer and the internet all came out of DARPA. So it was a very influential, organization. All came at the same time. Now, DARPA was also responsible for the modern vaccine, which was likely had its hand in the NHS grant and the development of the virus itself. So that's a little interesting kind of little piece there. But let's get back to the space race timeline. And I think this is what's important. Okay. This led to what's called a space race. So between the United States and Russia, they were really fighting for supremacy, right? If one got the upper hand, they lost the Cold War. And so the space race really was a race to see who could actually, make some sort of achievement, some milestone first. And each nation used its special achievements to demonstrate its scientific, technological, and organizational capabilities, right? And so when we see this display of dominance, we'll understand that it was more than just, taking it slow and figuring the stuff out. It was more like, how fast can we push this, or the illusion of dominance. And I think that's the important part. Much of this was the illusion of dominance. So it was also, like I said, a race to see who could be the first one to figure out what's going on above our heads. And so the United States launched Explorer 1. And this one went, had claimed to go up to 2,500 kilometers, right? It was the first spacecraft to detect what they call the Van Allen radiation belt. Although, by the way, this was actually discovered by Sergei, Vernov, who had already detected it. But, the United States, of course, goes through, they slapped their name on it, and they had, identified what the Russians already had identified, that there's a zone of energized particles. And there's these two kind of main layers or belts. And, these, the gap between these layers or these belts, right, ultimately had, in this gap had relatively small doses of radiation, they say, right? And so it says that there was a safe zone between these two gaps, which they identify as this inner donut. And the safe zone is considered prime real estate for satellites, is what they say. So when we look at this, we start to see that there's this kind of inner, the safe zone for wanting to explore, but they couldn't go any further than this inner belt. We read that even inside the safe zone, it can be subjected to high levels of radiation based on different weather events. And what's very interesting is that this is all coming from the NASA's website. So in 2014, a NASA engineer, Kelly Smith, shared that they were still needing the technology to go through the outer belt. He says, we must solve these problems before sending people through this region of space. And again, this is all on their website, on the NASA website. So what's very interesting is in 2014, we still had not the technology to safely get through this radiation belt. Now, for this part of the story, it's irrelevant as they're barely breaking the Kármán line. And the Kármán line is what we find is essentially 100 kilometers, right? And, when we start to look at, the height of the exploration, well, Russia successfully launched Vostok 1, and this was at 327 kilometers, and it did a full rotation and then came back. And it was done by Gagarin, right? So Yuri Gagarin. And he was the first one to go into outer space, and he completed one orbit of the Earth in 1961 and then came down. Unfortunately, he was mysteriously killed in a plane accident a few years later, which, kind of preserved his knowledge of the grave. And there's a lot of tales and fatalities based on reports of these two brothers where, it's unclear how much of this is propaganda, disinformation, or just lore, and it's up to you to decide. But ultimately what we find is, sticking to the facts, is that Russia really was dominating. I mean, Russia was undisputed the first to, ultimately do a lot of things. With Sputnik, it was the first Earth satellite, official Earth satellite, right? Then the first one to put animals in space, first one, to send a probe to the moon, first man in space, first woman in space, first spacewalk, right? All these were, by 1964, Russia had pretty much dominated the space race. And this is where JFK comes out and says that we need to win this war. And in 1961, he says, in this decade, we'll be on the moon. And that was like a mandate. But they had no real even space program. They had nothing near to make that claim. But, the president said, we're going to be the ones on the moon within this decade. And in 1961, the U.S. Congress committed to this goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Something they did not want to, fail. So we now kind of fast forward a little bit to Mercury Redstone later that year, where Shepard's mission was a 15-minute suborbital flight. And he ultimately just kind of popped up to about 187 kilometers and then came right back down. So his mission was 15 minutes. When it didn't go that far, he just kind of went up and went down. It's what they're doing right now, by the way. So right now when we see, how, Blue Origin, all these, they're kind of just going up and then coming right back down again. That's what they did with this. So we're back. Essentially what we've achieved in the last 5 years is what, they say they achieved in 1961. Then in 1962, John Glenn orbited 3 times the Earth before returning, and that was at 265 kilometers high. And Russia, again, takes the lead with Vostok 2, and they did the first one to actually do a spacewalk for 12 minutes. And Vostok 2 went as high as 475 kilometers. Okay, so that's as high as, Russia ever, really went. And the problem is that, Russia's winning. By all measure, Russia has won the Cold War. So the U.S. needs to win this thing by beating them into space. And so what's interesting is this where it gets a bit far-fetched. Okay, so just again for reference, this is the point up to this point, we'd barely broken the Kármán line. Okay. And, from 1961 to 1965, now this is the clincher. So really hang on to this concept. From 61 to 65, we never left low orbit. Okay. What the Russians said they got to, which I actually believe is fully true, was 475 by 1965. And it's measured. It's right. It's like we see, 327, 212, 475. It's all in that range of just kind of like, pushing the boundaries, learning more, etc. Well, the United States says that they gone to 265 and then, jumped up to 763 and then jumped up to 1300. Okay. Even though the Russians weren't able to make those advancements and they'd been in this game for far longer, but let's just say that's fine. But 2 years later, we're at the moon. Okay. So imagine this. They went from 265, right? If we were to come into this, they went to 265, 7, so they'd actually beat out, Russia. They went to 1,300 kilometers. And let's just say that they did. Okay, let's say that that's true. Okay, well, to then make a 16,000% increase 2 years later, go from 1,000 to 234,000, that's kind of a stretch in 1968. And then a year later, we're at the moon. And then we're further than the moon. And then by 1970, we've done, 400,000 kilometers. So that right there, 17,000% increase in 2 years is, that's a technological miracle. Even a greater miracle because, again, somehow we were able to get through the Van Allen radiation belt, which, again, up until 2014, say they were still needed to get the technology breakthrough. And yet, none of the astronauts died of radiation poisoning. They all lived to a ripe old age of dementia without ever having cancer. So that's a little bit odd. But just like that, we won the Cold War. And the United States now became, the champion. What an incredible underdog story, right? We went from no space program to calling it out, we're going to be on the moon in 10 years, and then doing this massive leap. Not just, a 10%, 100% increase. No. 17,000% increase in 2 years. And so the question, though, is how do we do it? Because that's amazing. I think what's also interesting is just the hubris that came after that. So President Nixon was super excited about all this, right? And in 1970, he's going around giving these lunar samples to 135 countries to show our dominance over them, right? So he's out there handing out moon rocks to everybody, saying, look at us, we've been to the moon, you guys haven't, ha. But there's only one problem. And the problem is the moon rocks turned out to be fake. So when the museum changed insurance carriers, they had to do an audit on all their prized items in their exhibit. Of course, a moon rock being one of them, but it turned out to be petrified wood. And geologists identified the moon rock as just wood, not even from the moon. And this was all over a big story. They all got reclaimed. They had to then go further. And what ended up happening is that this is just the beginning of many credibility issues, which caused skepticism if we'd actually even been to the moon or not. And while this sounds crazy, or at least it would have sounded crazy a few years ago, it's actually kind of normalized out a bit. The idea of, how do we actually go to the moon seems, if we look at different polls and things like this, it's more normalized now that we probably did not. Now, years ago, though, a fairly compelling documentary, this is back in the 70s, I believe, a fairly compelling documentary came out, which pokes a lot of holes in this official narrative that we landed on the moon 70 years ago and have never been back since. And it's about a 45-minute film. It's pretty funny, entertaining, whatever it is. He also creates a 3-minute recap here. And ultimately, the response is never refuting these claims with data. The response is always, send out Neil deGrasse Tyson to call him an idiot versus actually, giving real data to refute it. And so you'd say, well, why don't we just go to the tapes? Let's actually go and look at the data, right? Let's revisit the data, except they all went missing. They were recorded over. So the what I would imagine the world's biggest technical, achievement, they just like, oh, let's save space. That's literally their rationale was, let's save space and delete everything. And there was also a fire. I mean, the point simply is all of that data just somehow disappeared. And so we can't really go back and analyze anything. What's also interesting is that the official statement, they say they were short on magnetic tape, so they just erased everything and taped over it. That's the official statement in 1980. Okay, so they just taped over the world's greatest achievement. And what's also interesting is that if we were to look at what they're putting out, they even tell us. Washington Post title says, why NASA's new photos of the moon look super fake, even though they're not. That's literally their title of this, is don't believe your eyes. And now this is interesting. Just all the photos that were said were given, there's a lot of inconsistencies in these, right? And it's, when we look at, this is just poor graphic editing, ultimately. And there's a lot of issues to all of these, right? Also, we have the idea of the blue marble, and NASA has verified that the 2012 blue marble images are composites. So even on the NASA website, they acknowledge that we have no actual photos of the Earth, and that every photo of the Earth is a composite. So they take a bunch of images, and then they stitch them together, right? And so this is kind of on NASA's website, right? They even say this image was generated by combining these separate images to create this high quality image. And so there's no argument, no one's going to dispute this, that there are no images of Earth from space. The only images we have from Earth are from low orbit, where we've then recorded and then stitched them together, right? So what's also interesting is that when we look at a 2007 image of the Earth, right, called the blue marble, notice that it's not proportionate of what we would expect. And so if we go through, these are all official, right, official NASA images. Okay, this is not being pulled off some. This is an official NASA image. Okay, and you notice how the sizing of the different continents are quite different. And it really just kind of makes you start to question the entire narrative, right? If things don't add up, do we have a non-composite image, right? So if we go to the NASA website, we look around and we don't, right? We have two images on their website that they claim to have been taken from the moon. Same website, two vastly different sizes of the Earth. And neither of those look like a real photo to me. Both of those look incredibly rendered. This is just a low quality render, the 2015 one. So we start to really question this narrative of, have we actually even gone to the moon? Or if we have, why do we have so many inconsistencies? And the claim is, a bunch of stuff like, why the flag is waving in the wind if there's no atmosphere. Okay. Why are there shadows in, several different directions, indicating multiple light sources? Why, who took the photo of this? A third person would have to be with the camera to take the photo of somebody getting off the moon. They say, well, it was on the bottom of the lunar rover. The bottom of the landing gear. But try putting a camera on the bottom of, essentially on the landing pod, and then it not getting knocked off or something like that. It just doesn't make sense. And they say this came from a camera mounted on the outside of the lander. So I guess it just survived a really rough trip. We'll just have to chat up with that, right? There's what seems to be, stage props. The arms of the crosshair are washed out on the white stripes of the flag. Boots would have left their imprint on a lunar surface in moist material, but try leaving your footprint on a dry sandy beach. Nevertheless, the moon is completely just moon powder. So to see a compacted boot print would be unexpected. And then here, and if that's the case, if this, if the moon dust is there, why wasn't there all this moon dust get blown away by the blast radius beneath the lunar module? And also, I think this departure photo, where is the exhaust flame, right? So this is the photo of them saying they're leaving the moon, but I don't see any disturbance on the ground. And the response is that the exhaust from the mixture of nitrogen, and it's transparent. So that's very convenient. Ultimately, the other question is, where are the stars, right? Space is full of stars, as any 10-year-old will tell you. So why do they not appear in the photographs taken by the moon? And they say, well, it was the exposure settings. It also would have been very hard to fake, I guess, that. Who knows? Anyways, I just think that also when you asked the astronauts, if you look in videotapes of the astronauts, half of them say, oh yeah, it was the stars were so amazing. The other half says, I never saw the stars, right? And it starts to lead you to the question, how real was this, right? Was this, all fabricated on some sort of set, And again, I'm not I don't necessarily have to say that Stanley Kubrick, did this all, although that is a theory. The Stanley Kubrick theory is actually a fairly known theory, that he was the one that put this all together. And there's a lot of stuff that kind of goes between that. But there's a lot of other things, right? The ISS hairspray thing, I just can't seem to get past, right? There is, a lot of, reasons, okay? Also, when, it seems every year when they do polling, more and more people believe that it was faked. In 1994, Washington Post, 86% of the people believed that it was faked. In 2009, right? The other way around. 9% believed it was faked. In 2009, 25% believed it was faked. Now today, I think, if we're not above half at this point, right? So, a lot of stuff, right? How do we have a live transmission from the moon, 300,000 miles away? How do we have a cell phone, like a live transmission on that? I'm trying to say, while you consider that, right? Imagine that these are the phones, the consumer phones they're using in the day. This is literally the phones that they're using in the day, right? Right. This is the television technology at the time, right? This is what a portable camera looked like in their day and age, okay? And so the question is, how is it they were able to, in the same year, reduce it down? Even 20 years later, this is the most advanced product that we had. And then if we tend to look at just what the material they made was, it's laughable, but but okay, let's go back to the science, okay? Because this is all, let's do this. Let's just get to the science. On average, an adult human, and I had to calculate all this stuff because I just wanted to get to this, okay? On average, an adult human consumes about 550 liters of pure oxygen per day, right? That's at rest. And this rate can increase with any sort of physical activity. So a minimum, you're going to need 31 cubic meters, okay, of oxygen. So that's the size of 10 SUVs. But if you say, let's just look at what was needed for just the lunar module, okay, not the entire mission, but just when they're on the moon, that's the equivalent to 6 refrigerators. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at here? Okay, they needed the size of 6 refrigerators of oxygen just for that 75 hours for the 2 people, okay? So the total volume of the lunar module is 160 cubic feet, and you're going to tell me that 132 of that is just oxygen, right? Like I'm just trying to say, this is what they're telling me. I'm just taking the science, right? This is what they're telling me. And then why does the module only have a tank the size of a basketball? Okay? So you're going to tell me that 2 people were on the moon for 75 hours and their entire oxygen supply was the size of a basketball. when they needed 6 refrigerators. Like scuba divers go underwater for an hour maximum, and they're lugging around tanks just for an hour. How much do you need for weeks, right? And even if they're aware of like heavily compressed, increased PSI, I think you get the idea that it just doesn't check out, right? And then look, even if it's somehow possible, why haven't we been back? And you say, well, China says they landed on the moon, right? And this is a real image. I mean, they tell literally on the Chinese website, this is not some sort of, they say that this is a real image. And it's like, no, that's so obviously fake, right? And this one isn't much better. The one that got me was India. So here is, India saying that they landed on the moon, and it's unbelievable that this is what they're passing off as a real photograph. And we actually have I'll go back to this. Like, if you watch the video of this, it's laughable. And here you have mainstream media applauding India for landing on the moon. When you look at this, you say that first off, who took the photo? It's not even a photo. I mean, you look at it, like, I've dealt with, with a lot of Indian, animators in my day. And this is about what I'd expect, to be honest. And then Russia, right? They can't even make it. Theirs says that there's crash in the moon, and they're not even able to, at least they're honest. Russia's the only one that's ever been honest with space programs. I mean, that's facts, man. Russia's the only one that's ever been honest, and they're saying like we can't get there. Okay. And then it's interesting how, Artemis program, it seems to be legitimate, right? It almost feels like the Artemis program is legitimately trying to get to the moon, because 2002, it got canceled. Then they tried again in September, canceled. Then they said they had a successful reentry, but then that was for unmanned. Okay. Now for a manned flight, it was delayed in 2023, and it's now pending in 2024. And look, this year is almost over. So how, right? How did we land on the moon? First try in 1967, right? A manned mission, no less. And yet now we're failing to unmanned missions, right? Even with the failed attempts, the values are adding up, and ultimately, that's what it's all about. It's just about the money, right? 2 billion, 2 billion, 2 billion, 150, right? Like you see, how much money is going into these failed launches. And, many whistleblowers are starting to come out and tell their story about how we'd never actually gone to the moon, and it's actually just a multi-billion dollar swindle. So other than beating Russians, what other, since the Cold War is over, what's the reason we keep the space program going? And since 1950, we've spent $650 billion on what, right? And this accounts for as high as 4% of our total budget from 67 to 64 to 67. So we spent billions of dollars. And what do we have to show for it? More than that, NASA got $26 billion just last year. It's crazy town. So we're just handing money out like it's candy to private contractors. Almost $3 billion went to Elon Musk, right? $10 billion, was earmarked for Jeff Bezos. We have 3 people who figured out the scam and are essentially blackmailing the government to pull money out of the program. I mean, look, we've got, Richard Branson. He goes from, 2020 getting a, $500 million bailout. And then the next year he's in space somehow with this, I don't know, faux penis. I mean, it just feels like a joke, right? It just all feels like such a joke. And how is it they've barely been able to go where we were already at in the 50s? Like, they're excited about 88 kilometers or 100 kilometers. And yet what they said we'd done before was far greater. And I actually believe the Russian numbers, quite honestly. I believe we went to 400 kilometers. I believe the Russians went to 400 kilometers back in the 60s. But we're now bragging about 88 kilometers and 100 kilometers. So just for perspective, Musk says he's gone to 200 kilometers, right? Bezos at 100 kilometers, Branson at 88 kilometers, but it's far below what you'd expect in 2024. The last two attempts to get rockets in space have failed, and the third attempt, couldn't make re-entry, right? And yet, even with these failures, somehow we have a car that went to Mars, right? Something just doesn't add up to this, especially like a 6-year-old, 6 years ago, right? This worked. It screams publicity stunt, not an actual mission. And, by the way, how far is Mars? 225 million kilometers is what they say. Okay. So we've just made a leap. We can't, and just put this in perspective. These guys are barely able to get above 100 kilometers. Okay. And yet we've gone 225 million kilometers to get to Mars. And more than that, we're live streaming back from Mars. I mean, come on. It feels like the media is, so complicit, and the scientific community is just counting on our stupidity. But it's I just get frustrated because it feels like we're being mocked, right? It's not even like it's just a bad joke. And so the question is, why hasn't this been exposed yet? And the answer is the Freemason Connection, right? They've all been Freemasons. All of the astronauts are Freemasons. They're all Jesuits, right? Buzz Aldrin, is a known Freemason, right? Here he is. He even carried a flag supposedly to the moon, right? So, when we kind of go and we look up these NASA, we asked NASA, what's going on with this? They even have a statement that says, even if we wanted to fake the Apollo or any of the programs, there's no possibility we could have done so because the news media has covered it all. So their whole line of defense is that the news media wouldn't lie. And yet, again, going back to some of these, known 33-degree Freemasons, right? Now, I'm gonna wrap this up, but it goes one level deeper first. And I'm just gonna tease you with this little piece here, and then I'm gonna let you go. But here's what it is. Let's go back to 1950s. Operation Fishbowl. Imagine a fishbowl, would you? And this operation was a series of high altitude nuclear explosions. And again, if we look at the data, look at the altitudes, and something very interesting stands out. The altitude of the detonation, right, was or is the same altitude as where we can't get past. It's the lower belt. Highest detonation being at 500 kilometers. And so I think it's pretty interesting, and it leads us to a question: what were they doing with these high explosions? Were they just looking to punch a hole in the sky? And it kind of, again, in perspective, nothing that we have is above 500 kilometers. ISS, they say, is at 400. And that's where the detonation of Starfish Prime was at 400. And so again, there's this real question about, were these detonations because we couldn't get past this height? Now, with this information, it goes really quickly into wanting to find out more. And I've been down this rabbit hole. I recommend watching my course on credibility traps because there are things we can prove. Okay. And then if we go any further than that, we're going to get ourselves into some serious credibility traps. We may actually end up, moving into spaces where we start believing things that are an extrapolation of things that we can now prove, because everything I believe, I can make a solid case on what we can prove. Anything past this, I don't think we can prove. And so I just want to recommend watching my video on this of like how to navigate not going off the deep end, not becoming a lemming where you kind of follow something to a furthest logical conclusion that takes you into, full on conspiracy, crazy town stuff. Okay. Look, I know I come off as crazy sometimes, but like, you got to maintain, just stick with the stuff you can prove. And ultimately, just keep calm, right? Reclaim your mental sovereignty and recognize that, we have been attacked with psyops by the deceiver and by those who want to control and those that want to siphon money and those that want to make it seem like we are, spinning on a random rock in the middle of a random place and that God is nowhere to be seen and God is nowhere near us. But what if God is closer than we think?